words. So over to you, Kristen.
All right, thank you, Clinton, and thanks everyone for being here on this Wednesday afternoon. I know how busy term 2 is, so really great that you could make it amidst all the chaos. Just before we get started, I think I'll just give you a quick overview of who I am. I won't read through all of this because I know you've been sent out some of this information with the event, but yeah, I've been teaching legal and business humanities type subjects for quite a long time, also a qualified lawyer, been working in curriculum development for quite a few years, and I even worked on the VCE Business Management Edrolo textbook last year, which some of you may be familiar with. So yeah, I'm basically loving being involved in the legal studies project. Combining my passions of education and law together is kind of ideal for me. So that's me. I know some of you have added your name and school to the chat, but if you haven't already, please, if you could, it's really interesting to find out where everybody's from. And we will move on. Something else I would like you to add to the chat, just as a little starter here. When you think about the new VCE Legal Studies study design, which of these babies is best describing your mood? Maybe you haven't even looked at it yet, so you don't have too many thoughts, or maybe you do actually have some feelings about it. So just for fun, if you could type in just a number into the chat as to which baby is best describing how you're feeling at the moment. And if you don't have that many thoughts on the study design, even just how you're feeling today in the midst of term 2 would be interesting to know.
A lot of triumphants coming through, Kristen, which is great for a Wednesday afternoon. And a couple of distressed, which of course you kind of expect, right? But and a little bit of and a blend that feels in between, kind of like triumphant and distressed, like a full gamut.
I would say I was probably feeling about number 4 when I first saw the study design and thinking about how we were going to implement things, but I'm certainly now baby number 2 now that I've had a lot of time to work on the project. So we'll move on. We might revisit these babies a bit later on, but we don't have a lot of time, so we'll get straight into it. Learning intentions for today is to understand the changes to the VCE Legal Studies study design, but also how Edrolo can help you implement these changes. All right, quick roadmap of what we're hoping to get through in the hour. I will be moving through quite quickly, but you will be able to refer back to the slides at a later date. We'll send those out to you. So there's often a lot of text on some of these slides, but it's mostly because we've sort of copied and pasted from the study design just so you can see those changes. So we're not expecting you to read all the text on the slides, but those 8 points are what we're hoping to get through for the hour. All right, so let's jump into it. Just a quick overview of some of the sections at the start of the study design. And I should say before we get started as well that what we're going through today is Edrolo's interpretation of the study design. We've had a lot of time. We're not busy teaching students at the moment. We've had a lot of hours, a lot of days, a lot of weeks really dissecting this study design, and we've spent a lot of time interpreting things and working out how we were going to incorporate the changes into our textbook. So whilst we certainly are not VCAR, we are not able to speak for VCAR. If you do have particular questions about the study design that aren't clear, you should definitely still clarify those with VCAR. But what we're going through today is our interpretation, the things that we've noticed that we're really going to highlight for you, those changes, and then you can obviously have your own interpretation as well, or clarify anything that you need to with VCAR. So to start off, just looking at that first section of the study design, the scope, looking at the changes, we're sort of following a bit of a traffic light system here, where the changes in red are the things that have been removed. The changes shown on the screen in orange are the things that have changed. And the green is something new. So looking at the current scope, we can see that one of the most notable changes, and I think a lot of people are quite happy about this, from what I've heard, is the removal of the recent and recommended reforms to the criminal and civil justice system. So that is no longer a key knowledge dot point. We'll look at that in a bit more detail shortly. But what has been added, which I don't think is really new, but it's actually just there in the scope, is that students develop an appreciation of the ability of people to seek and influence changes to the law. I don't think that's too significant, but something that is significant there is what's in the orange. which is those really comprehensive definitions of the principles of justice. So we did have brief definitions before, but now they are quite comprehensive. So we've actually analysed those in a bit of detail. So I'll move on to that here. So we've had a bit of a look at that, and we're quite interested by the equality definition. I'm not sure if anybody else has sort of noticed that. It's a very comprehensive definition. It sort of encompasses that that idea of equity within it. And this sort of really stood out to me because I'm also an economics teacher, and I know if anyone else is teaching that or was teaching that in the old study design, it was a whole sort of area of study looking at the difference between equity or looking at equity in general. So that really stood out to me, and I thought this is something that I think would be quite important for students to think about, is this idea of equality and how to achieve equality or to achieve equal outcomes, often there needs to be equitable policies involved to ensure that the opportunities that people have are actually an equal opportunity. So we've sort of highlighted that idea, and some of you might recognise that little cartoon over there in the corner. I've certainly seen that a few times in a few different versions of it. And I think this is just something that we've taken to be quite an important part of this definition. And we've incorporated some examples that really highlight what this, the bolded part of that definition of equity, what that really means in practice. And we've got some legal examples to go with that in our textbook. So that was the definition of equality. There's also obviously those definitions of fairness and access. I don't think they're too different or too surprising from what we had before, which is why we've sort of focused on the equality principle. And something we have included in our textbook and something that we keep coming back to is this idea of equality. Achieving equal outcomes is a little bit different to treating everybody equally or treating everybody the same. So we've included a little Venn diagram like this, which I think is a visual representation of that equality definition, combining that equal treatment with equitable policies where they're necessary can lead to that overall outcome of equality or an equal outcome of opportunity. So I just thought I would include that there because this was something we found a little bit problematic when we first looked at the study design, but now that we've sort of understood it in this manner, we're quite comfortable with applying those definitions now to the content. All right, let's move on. Aims of the study design. I won't spend too long on this, but again, traffic light system, the red is something that's been removed. The orange is something that has just simply changed. So this one here, we can see we've already mentioned the fact that we have that removal of the recent and recommended reforms, and the part there about the in the new aims of the study design, the orange section there. It doesn't look like that's too different, but it is a new dot point, and it seems to reflect the fact that in the new study design, we now have specific subheadings that relate to the principles of justice, and we've clarified this with VCAR that it is only those dot points in those particular sections, those key knowledge dot points, that need to be explicitly linked to the principles of justice. So I see that as quite a significant change, and we're going to talk about that as we go through each area of study as well. So we will be talking more about that orange point. All right, let's move on. So in terms of content changes, we're going to go through in a bit of detail each unit and each area of study within each unit. As we go through those changes, it might be interesting if you could add something to the chat so others can see it. It might be good to see what other people's thoughts are and see whether it sort of aligns with yours, or maybe somebody has something they've thought of that you haven't actually thought of, or maybe it's something we haven't thought of as well when we're looking at these changes. So it'd be great to see if you could add something, some sort of idea to the chat as we go through. Now, I should say that I can't see the chat at the moment just because I'm in the presenter screen, but we will be looking at any comments or any questions at various points.
Oh, sorry to stop you there, Kristen. There is one from Jacinta, which was around the definitions, and it's a comment, I think, more than a question, but I think that's what examiners were already leaning to, re-equality just now codifying it. So it's not necessarily changing it, but just more codifying in the study design.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep, I definitely didn't want to suggest that there'd been any change to those principles, but just that we'd been given a lot more comprehensive definitions now, which is great, in my opinion, and probably most people's opinions. It's a bit clearer as to what each of those words mean, which I think is helpful for teachers and for students. All right, but yeah, great if you can add comments to the chat. Really helpful for everybody involved. All right, so quick high-level overview. Just regarding units 1 and 2, it's probably been obvious if you've looked at the study design already that there's a bit of a switch so that we now have Unit 1 having a clear focus on criminal law and Unit 2 clearly focused on civil. Excuse me. So key knowledge dot points haven't changed a great deal, just been moved between units. There are some additions and removals of content. And the rights AOS in Unit 2 is now explicitly about human rights. So I'm just going to have a drink now. Just getting over a bit of a cold. All right, Units 3 and 4, very little change to Unit 3. Mostly just rephrasing, reordering, a few additions and removals. Unit 4 are the most complex to unpack. So there's lots of rearrangement of content between the AOS, lots of rephrasing. There's a few additional knowledge points and a few removals, which we'll look at in detail. There's obviously a new topic within Unit 4 covering constitutional reform. All right, so in detail, looking at each AOS for each unit now. We won't spend long on this one because there's not really been a great deal of change, just a slight wording change, an overview of the roles of the Parliament and the courts. We didn't actually have the word roles in there, so that's sort of a minor change there. Moving on to AOS 2 for Unit 1. Now we just have some, again, minor changes here. The role of statute law and common law, that has been removed in developing the elements of the offence and the defences. That's completely gone. Added in, we now have possible sanctions. However, that was covered in Unit 2 AOS 1 in the current study design, so it's almost like it's just been moved around. Something else that might be significant is when looking at the 2 criminal offences in this unit, the trends and statistics there must be in relation to another Australian jurisdiction. So if you were using a different country as your sort of comparison for that, then you might need to change that to an Australian comparison. So as you know, this hasn't changed. There's 2, students must study 2 particular criminal offences in detail. Now, for Edrolo, the textbook, we provide 3 options. The options we've got a murder, assault and culpable driving. Okay. All right, moving on to area of study 3.
Kristen, sorry to interrupt you again. Masaro's, Jan, actually, I went with his surname. Sorry, Jan. Jan has just commented on that previous slide that you had up. Very much, her comment is very much like the rearranging of material in Units 1 and 2 makes more sense to focus on criminal law in Unit 1 and civil law in Unit 2. And Stephanie has also then just replied saying it's actually changed back from the study design before.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, from the one we had before the current study design. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I absolutely agree that it makes a lot more sense this way. And I think that's what I've heard from most other teachers as well. So probably we're all happy about that. Great, thank you for those comments, guys. All right, area of study 3. Now there's a bit more change in here. So there's a big removal there. There's 2 recent criminal cases and the overview of charges, courts that were involved, sanctions, all of those dot points there in relation to 2 recent criminal cases, they're all removed. So that seems to be quite a lot of content removed there. But what we now have is that new dot point, the difficulties faced by different groups in the criminal justice system, such as First Nations people, young people, and then there's a list of other people there as well. Now, this is something that's completely new. This is something we're authoring at the moment. And yeah, I think it is a bit of a challenging topic. We are having a First Nations consultant working with us at the moment to assist us with content creation and review, making sure that we're culturally appropriate in the way we're presenting this information. and accuracy as well. So we're hoping to have some really good content there available for that new dot point. Besides that, other changes to this AOS is this new subheading that appears. Now, I'm not going to link to this now because it's actually just a link to the study design, but we now have in the study design a heading that explicitly states the principles of justice and the criminal justice system. And it is only those dot points within that section of the key knowledge dot points that need to be explicitly linked to the principles of justice, which I think is probably more significant for year 12 when you've got that external assessment, the exam to worry about. So we'll also look at that when we get to unit 3 and 4 as well, or unit 3 in this case. All right, so that's unit 1. When you get the slides, you can have a look at any links that are in this slideshow. All right, unit 2, moving on to AOS 1. So we're now looking at civil law in particular. All right, something that's removed is the role of statute law and common law in developing elements and defences. So I think, so what's happened here, we've actually got a lot of things that have obviously moved from Unit 1 AOS 3 into Unit 2 AOS 1. So what I'm doing is analysing the changes that relate there. All right, so what's been added is the possible remedies in relation to 2 areas of civil law. And this is an addition, but it was something that was covered in Unit 2 AOS 2 before, or in the current study design. There's not really any other changes there, so we'll move on. But I will just note that in this AOS, again, like in the current study design, students still need to study 2 particular areas of civil law. So Edrolo provide 3 options there. We've got negligence, defamation, and misleading or deceptive conduct. We've actually got our defamation content ready already as a sample. So if you were wanting to have a look at that, or indeed even use it this year, get in touch with us and we'll organise those samples for you.
Kristen, I'll just jump in again. On the previous slide, not the one that you just had, the one before that, I think it was around First Nations. Stephanie asked, does it mean that you need to cover, or we need to cover all, or just one, or some?
Yeah, good point. Good question, I think. Because it does say such as, I mean, I won't speak for VCAR at all, but I would assume that not all would need to be covered. But again, this is probably more a question for the VCAR to answer, because it's not, we can't actually speak for VCAR, but I would assume that because the language used there is such as, so difficulties faced by different groups, such as, that those are more options. And given that this is year 11, it's obviously internally assessed. There's not going to be an external exam that you don't have control over. I would assume that those were options, but again, definitely to clarify, get in touch with Megan Jeffrey at the VCAR. She's the curriculum manager for this subject, so she'll be able to comprehensively clarify that for you for certain.
Another question from Amanda, Kristen, back I think it was where you were about to continue from, and a thanks from Stephanie. Amanda said it is a minus to lose these case study opportunities, which allowed the students to apply their knowledge, which is a big part of the exam style question. So not so much a question as a comment.
Yeah, I know. It seems like there's a lot being removed there in relation to those criminal cases. It is still. Yeah, I mean, we're still looking at the 2 criminal offences, but yeah, looking at those recent cases is not sort of explicit and comprehensive in there anymore. Does seem a bit of a shame. I guess if there's content being added, there has to be some removed, I guess, to make room for it. And yeah, the same thing has happened. Is this where we're up to? I think it was. Yep. I think we're up to this part, AOS 2 in Unit 2. The same things happen there with the civil cases. So 2 recent civil cases, and for each case, all of those dot points. That key knowledge dot point has been removed, and again replaced with that dot point about the difficulties faced by the different groups. And in this AOS, it's obviously in relation to civil law rather than criminal. So I think, I mean, the way that we've approached that is we will be looking at particular cases within that new dot point anyway. So it still enables students to be able to analyse cases, if that makes sense. I mean, that's certainly what we're doing. We're certainly still including criminal cases and civil cases, and we're certainly still analysing them. One of the slides coming up is it actually goes through our framework that we're using to analyse cases, which is used in both units 1 and 2, as well as 3, 4, and that is designed to have that same framework so students do get familiar with being able to analyse and interpret cases and the significance of them and things like that. So hopefully that kind of still enables that learning to happen and those skills to be developed in terms of analysing cases. All right, so again, yeah, I've mentioned that we have the First Nations consultant helping with that new dot point. Again, in this AOS, there is a new subheading. You can have a look at the study design, or there's a link to it here once you look at the slides, to show that there's only a small group of key knowledge dot points that need to have that explicit link to the principles of justice. Later on in this presentation, I'll just be going through an example of how we are providing that link to the principles of justice and making it really clear which content or which key knowledge dot points need to have that explicit link to the principles of justice. All right, Unit 2, AOS 3. A bit of a change here in terms of the focus or the name, but the dot points have changed, quite a bit actually. So what's been removed is there over on the left. I'm not going to read through that. The obvious change is that there's now the focus on it being explicitly about human rights. And so that dot point about international declarations and treaties is now explicitly about the Human Rights Declaration, Universal Declaration of Human Rights. There's the removal of the bit about reforms to the protection of rights, but what we do have now is the ability to really focus in on particular issues. So I guess a lot of that content that's been removed is still going to be covered somewhat when looking at the human rights issues specifically. So what's been added there with those human rights, or one human rights issue, and looking at the nature and development of the human right, the laws that apply to it, conflicting attitudes, possible reforms. So we do still have a lot of that content that's been removed. It's just that you'll now be looking at it through, I guess, the lens of one particular issue. Now, the study design says that students must study one human rights issue, and it says they need to have one case study in relation to that human rights issue. What we've done in our textbook, we've provided two options. So our two options are the rights of young people and climate change and human rights. We're still to determine what our case study is for climate change, but what we do have already available as a sample is the Raise the Age campaign is what we've focused on in relation to the rights of young people. Okay, so that is units 1 and 2. We'll move on to unit 3 and 4 now, which I think are a bit more complex. And obviously the changes to units 3 and 4 are quite important to get right, because we do have that external exam to make sure that students are prepared for, because we know that the questions on that exam could be from any of the sort of new content or from the changed content or the changed skills. So I'll go through these sort of a bit more carefully. So Unit 3 AOS 1, we've got a bunch of dot points there that have been removed there on that left-hand side. And again, notably, it's the recent and recommended reforms to the criminal justice system has been completely removed. Now, I'll just start from the top. The right to a fair hearing for the accused, that's kind of been replaced by the right to silence. So in the added column there, we have the right to silence, the accused right to silence has been added. Right to give evidence as a vulnerable witness has been replaced somewhat by the right to give evidence using alternative arrangements, which is it's a very similar thing, I think, to reflect a change in the actual law in relation to this. So not too different. Committal proceedings are gone, sentence indications is gone. and obviously the reforms. All right, we have slight changes to the VLA and the CLC's topic, so Victorian Legal Aid and Community Legal Centres. There's an addition there where we now have to look at how they can assist victims as well as an accused. Slight change in relation to key personnel. It now mentions the roles of key personnel rather than the responsibilities. So I'm not sure how significant that is, probably not too significant. But notably, there is the inclusion of the magistrate mentioned in there. So again, probably not too significant, but we're definitely making sure our textbook includes these things. Another small thing is that in the purposes of sanctions, we now have mentioned explicitly in the key knowledge dot point of general and specific deterrence being necessary to teach and learn about. All right, besides that, other changes, there's some minor rephrasing that I haven't included here because it wasn't really too notable. And again, this AOS has that subheading within the key knowledge dot points to indicate which particular key knowledge dot points must be explicitly linked to the principles of justice. So it is just a collection of those dot points in that AOS. So it's not the case like I think we're currently doing where every piece of content, every lesson, every topic is linked to those principles of justice, and students get quite fed up with that. I think we now have a real sort of clear guidance as to which of the particular concepts or institutions or principles of law need to be, or which aspects of the criminal justice system and the civil justice system, which of those need to be explicitly linked to the principles of justice, which I think will be a welcome change for most people. Okay, moving on to AOS 2 for Unit 3. All right, so again, we've got quite a bit removed there over on the left. Purposes of pre-trial procedures isn't in there. Now, judicial powers of case management, that dot point is gone. However, it's now incorporated into the other dot point on the roles of key personnel. So on the screen, what you can see there in the additions or the added column, what's been greyed out there is what we already have, and what's in black is the change. So you can see over in that added column that we now have, again, the magistrate is added to the roles of key personnel, and the role of case management is now included in that dot point. So even though it's kind of been removed as its own standalone dot point, it is now incorporated into another. Now, strangely, over on the removed column, we have the purposes of remedies is removed, but it does sound like that's a bit strange to remove it, but we still do have the dot point on damages and injunctions and their specific purposes. It's just that there was that standalone dot point purposes of remedies generally. That's no longer in there. And of course, the recent and recommended reforms that we mentioned earlier, they've been removed in relation to the civil justice system as well. Okay. Other than that, what's been added? Not too much. So in that added column, as I said before, what has been greyed out is what we currently have already, and that hasn't changed. The changes there are in the black. So we now have a requirement to look at the purposes as well as the appropriateness of alternative dispute resolution methods. So I'm not sure how significant that is, but definitely we will be covering that. We'll be looking at what the purpose of each of those methods of dispute resolution is. And finally...
Sorry to jump in and interrupt you. Quick question from Jack, just while you're on it. Didn't the roles of key personnel also include legal practitioners? Is that deleted too?
Yes, actually that may be an omission on this slide. We do have a new dot point, so maybe that might be why I haven't included it, because it sort of is already in the current study design. It was the roles of key personnel, including legal practitioners, or I believe it actually was the responsibilities of. That is now its own standalone dot point.
That's what Jacinta's also jumped in and clarified as well. She said it's the next dot point.
Yeah, yep, it is. It's now, if you've got the study design in front of you, I haven't actually got it in front of me, but the need for legal practitioners is in both the criminal and the civil equivalents of this AOS. Yeah, so I think that's why I haven't included it here. There's just probably too many changes to include in this summary table, but because we didn't view that as being too different to what's in the current study design, but we certainly have taken note of the fact that the phrasing has changed in relation to that. So it was the responsibilities of key personnel, including legal practitioners. Now it's the need for legal practitioners. So yeah, it may be noteworthy. I mean, in any case, in our textbook, we've certainly covered those points separately. All right. Okay, where was that to? Oh, so the third dot point there about what has been added. Interestingly, the purposes and appropriateness of institutions used to resolve disputes, the courts weren't included in there, I guess because they were covered so much in all the other key knowledge dot points, but they have actually now been added to that explicit dot point, so that they can be compared, I guess, to CAB and VCAT. And that's certainly how we've treated it. We've looked at those three institutions together and compared them. And I think notably, I believe that might be, it might be one of the key skills. I haven't actually got it in front of me, but there certainly is that possibility that could come up, given that all those three institutions are now in the same key knowledge dot point. All right. Oops, I flicked back accidentally. All right, and again, we have that new subheading in the AOS 2, like we do in AOS 1 for Unit 3, that indicates which of the key knowledge dot points need to be explicitly linked to those principles of justice, making it a lot easier for everybody. Okay, we'll move on to Unit 4. And I'll just rely on Clinton again to interrupt me. I can't see the chat with any questions, but Clinton, let me know if there are any as we go through Unit 4. Because Unit 4, I think, is a little bit more complex to unpack.
So maybe I encourage anyone to post their questions as Kristen goes along, and then we'll pause after Unit 4 and run through them all together, if that makes sense. Tanya's popped in a question about the availability of textbooks, etc. But I'll let Adam, who's also monitoring the chat, jump in and answer that one in the text, or address it when he talks a little bit later, because he'll be across all the timelines for that as well. But otherwise, chat is under control. Some good conversation though. People are answering each other's questions and commenting. So there's lots of comments and things happening, but I'll just try and draw out where there are questions that you need to stop and answer.
All right, amazing. All right, now Unit 4, it is a bit more problematic in my view anyway. Just in terms of how to unpack, I don't think it will be problematic. I just think it's hard to analyse what these changes are because they're kind of all over the place. And that's why I've sort of used a different system here to summarise what those changes are. So for Unit 4 AOS 1, there's a bit of rephrasing, there's a bit of movement of content from Unit 4 AOS 2, moved into AOS 1, and then there are a couple of new points, which kind of are new, but kind of are not new. So let's just go through them step by step. The green is the rephrasing, what we've interpreted as being a rephrase of content that was kind of already there. In some cases, it's not a complete sort of switch over to a new dot point. In some cases, there might be little elements that are slightly different, but it is in most cases where we've said rephrase, it is quite a similar dot point in terms of what we think the content that needs to be covered is. So the first green highlighted part there, the lawmaking powers, or used to be the division of the lawmaking powers, I believe. So there's not much difference there. I think that one really is a straight rephrase, very similar to what you're currently teaching. Okay, one High Court case that has had an impact. That one's another one that's been rephrased slightly. Won't go through the exact wording for all of these because that would obviously take a long time, but things that we've highlighted here are things that you probably would get out your old and your new study design and have a close look at what that rephrase means. We've obviously incorporated any of the changes into our textbook. The third one there, factors that affect the ability. Again, that's just a rephrase, but then there is a new sub-dot point in there about international pressures, but we've interpreted that as being very similar to the old dot point about the international declarations and international treaties. That's certainly how we're treating that. The representative nature of Parliament. I think, yep, again, that's part of the rephrase. But the next bit there about the role of the High Court in protecting the principle of representative government, we've called that a rephrase, even though that's kind of new in that dot point, I believe, because it's sort of replacing the old dot point on section 7 and section 24 of the Constitution. So we're sort of interpreting that content as being very similar, but it's all sort of been rearranged somewhat in that first half of that AOS 1 for Unit 4. All right, so the second half of that AOS 1, so these dot points and these headings are straight from the study design here. We have a lot of content there that is pretty much the same, but it's just been moved from AOS 2. So that's the content that is in blue, highlighted in blue there. The thing that is new is a bit of a deeper dive into the doctrine of precedent. We now need to cover specifically those different types of precedent there. So that is actually just something new that's been added to AOS 1 of Unit 4. All right, so it's really not that different. It just looks a lot different because there's been so much movement between AOS, I think. Right, I'll move on unless there are any questions. Moving on. All right, so Unit 4 AOS 2. Again, we've got a lot of movement. Some things have moved from AOS 1. Well, actually, only one thing has moved. But we do have a lot of new content. Then we also have a lot of rephrasing in relation to law reform. So let's start with the first half about law reform. There's not too much different here. Very slight rephrasing. The means by which individuals or groups can influence law reform. The only difference there is that it previously or it currently says the ability and means by which they can influence law reform. So I wouldn't think that's too significant. What I do think is significant, though, in relation to some of those other dot points in green there, is the fact that the focus now in relation to VLRC and in relation to royal commissions and parliamentary committees, so what we've noticed here is that instead of referring to the recommended or recent recommended reforms from VLRC or royal commissions or parliamentary committees, it's now referring to the inquiry itself that then would probably have resulted in any recommended reforms. So the way that we're treating this is to really focus on the inquiry itself rather than simply focusing on whatever the recommended law reform is that came out of that inquiry. In relation to the VLRC inquiries and in relation to royal commissions and parliamentary committees, it does state here in the study design that one recent VLRC inquiry and one recent royal commission or parliamentary committee inquiry need to be studied. We've provided, or we will be providing you with 2 of each in the Edrolo textbook, so that there's a bit of choice there for students, and so that teachers and students can utilise, look at more than one if they need to, because it does actually say the role of royal commissions or parliamentary committees in law reform. It does actually have that dot point as a plural dot point now, so it might indicate that more than one needs to be studied. Now, it is important to note that it still states it still states that one recent royal commission or parliamentary committee inquiry need to be studied, which, as far as I can tell, indicates that you can still focus on just one or the other. You only need to study royal commissions or you only need to study parliamentary committee inquiries. Again, you could double check that with VCAR, but that hasn't changed since the last study design. But what is important to note is that we do still have the need to look at recent inquiries, which the study design does state is within the last 4 years. I think we've got a slide coming up on that in this presentation. I will just note here, though, that I think it's on the next slide, but we are looking into which particular Royal Commissions or which VLRC inquiries or Parliamentary Committee inquiries we're going to use. And we'll be using, where possible, any inquiries where the report has occurred this year. I think I've got them on the next slide, so I'll leave that until we get to that. And I'll move on to constitutional reform, that second half of AOS 2. This is the new bit. There's one dot point in there that we did have before in relation to referendums. Obviously, the referendums, there is some content on referendums in the current study design that you'll be teaching this year, but there's a whole bunch of new dot points there as well. So, constitutional reform, reasons for constitutional reform, that's brand new. Now, we actually have chosen that as one of our sample lessons that we've authored, and that's all ready to go. If you wanted to have a sample of that, reach out and we can provide that to you. The other one that is also available as a sample is factors affecting the success of a referendum. Now, this was all brand new content. We've researched these thoroughly, and we've even checked our research with VCAR and our reasons and our factors with VCAR. And what we've been told is that as long as students can provide a valid reason that is supported with evidence, then that is an accurate or a valid reason that can be included in an exam answer. So what we've done is we have a list of reasons that are all coupled with a particular past referendum to demonstrate that that was a reason that was used for possible constitutional reform. We've also looked at factors affecting success of a referendum, and we've linked those to actual past referendums that have either failed or been successful. So we've done a lot of that research for you. We've got that available in sample lessons at the moment. All right, besides that, there's two more very new dot points. The significance of the 1967 referendum. This may be something that people have been covering, teachers and students have been covering already in relation to the current dot point about the significance of one referendum. It's now explicitly got to be the 1967 referendum, and in particular the question about First Nations people. Now, the last dot point in the study design may be the most problematic, particularly for us in terms of how we are going to address this, because our textbook is going to print in approximately September, I think, and I'm not sure we're going to have had a referendum by then, because obviously this final dot point is very much related to the possible future constitutional reform in relation to the referendum we're expecting on the First Nations voice to Parliament. We are going to include content on this. We may not have an outcome to that, or I assume we won't have an outcome to that by the time we go to print, but we will have some digital resources for that. I am wondering how that is going to be considered possible constitutional reform next year, once it's either happened and been successful or not. However, this dot point about possible future constitutional reform is including any possible future constitutional reform. So we'll be considering some other possibilities as well as the First Nations voice. I'll be very interested to hear people's thoughts on that one. But that will be our approach to it, is to look at a variety of possible future reforms and provide lots of researched information in the textbook. Okay, well, I think we are done looking at the sort of the minor details of all those dot points. So I'll quickly pop through this bit because I'm very aware that time is passing very quickly. Just wanted to make a quick comment about the last 4 years, that requirement in the study design. So there's certain criminal cases and civil cases in Unit 1 and 2 where students need to look at recent cases, and there's obviously the inquiries of the law reform bodies in Unit 4 that need to be the past 4 years, which I mentioned earlier. Where possible, we'll be using examples from this year so that they are valid for most of that life of the study design. Then we'll be updating them sort of midway through. All right, moving on.
I'll jump. Sorry, Kristen. Let me know when to go to questions for Unit 4, given there was so much there.
Okay. No, go for questions for Unit 4 for sure.
Okay, cool. Jack has asked, and I'm not sure when this, which slide it was related to, but does it mean that external affairs power has been taken out?
That's in relation to.
Might have been quite early.
No, I don't believe. I would have to go and double check back at the study design. So maybe we'll get back to you, but I think that is the one that might have been covered now by international pressures.
Danielle did then respond saying she thinks it's somewhat similar to the international point, which could be that.
I'm pretty sure. I don't have the study design in front of it. What we'll do is we'll aim to look at those questions in the chat and provide a comprehensive answer. But yeah, it does seem to be that's one of the ones that's been rephrased. I wouldn't say that it's completely gone, but this is something that we haven't clarified this particular one with VCAR yet because we haven't authored this content, but it is something that we will be double checking. Any of the new content, we contact VCAR directly and just double check what their intention was by that key knowledge dot point. Just to make sure that we're making sure our textbook is accurately reflecting the intention of the VCAR study design. All right.
Cronus has asked, does the final dot point for a Unit 4 AOS mean that even after the voice reform outcome this year, students will need to know another possible future constitutional reform?
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak for VCAR again on that one either. It's something that we will double check with VCAR when we're authoring that content. We're sort of leaving that one a bit till last to see what sort of the most recent updates in the real world are about that one. But it certainly indicates that by saying possible future constitutional reform and then just stating that it just includes that one particular example about the voice. So yeah, I'm very interested to hear what VCAR have to say about that one as well. And I understand they'll be doing their own webinar, you know, the official information at a later stage in this year. So definitely something that I think we'll all want to clarify a bit further for sure.
Jacinta also just popped in a question. No explicit mention of external affairs power, but could be weaved into other dot points, question mark.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's how we've interpreted it. We haven't finished authoring much of the Unit 4 content, and what we do though is we dissect everything very carefully, and anything where we still have questions, we contact VCAR directly and make sure that we have clarified any uncertainties like that with VCAR for sure. All right.
There are all the questions for now.
Oh, amazing. Now, I'm well aware we're running out of time, so I'm going to skip through really quickly the skills changes because I don't feel they're very significant. I've got a list of things there. Generally speaking, what I've noticed or what our team have noticed when we've analysed this is the main differences there have only really occurred because the actual key knowledge dot points have changed. So I'm not going to run through those step by step because it's a little bit repetitive in terms of the fact that the changes appear to be just in relation to where the key knowledge dot point has changed. So I'll leave those there and you can have a read through of the slides at a later date for that one. Assessment, not much to really note here. Units 1 and 2, slight changes in terms of the tasks that could be given, just more options there. Or just a bit more detail about what each option it could involve. So I'll just let people have a look at that themselves. Just good to note that there is a change to what the suitable tasks recommended are. Notably for Unit 3 and 4, there's not really a change to the suitable tasks recommended or what may be used in this case. So the major difference there, though, is that for Unit 4, Outcome 1 used to be worth 40% of the school assessed coursework. It's now worth 60, and Outcome 2 is worth 40. So there's been a bit of a flip for Unit 4, where Outcome 1 is now has the higher weighting. For Unit 3, it's still 50-50 with Outcome 1 and Outcome 2. So I'll let people dissect that themselves. I think we've had the questions coming throughout. I'm going to move on and quickly flick through a few of our slides that sort of showcase what we're doing with the new course. And we're really going to run out of time here. So I'm going to skip through really quickly and let people have a look at these in their own time if they want to. There's a lot of information on the slide. I've provided some screenshots of how we're sort of dealing with all of these changes and what our features are of our textbook that are going to help teachers deliver the course and help students learn the course, hopefully in a more effective and efficient way. So just some features of what our textbook is going to include. We're going to be including an introduction to legal studies for the Unit 3-4 book only, simply because we know there are students that do Units 3 and 4 without having done Units 1 and 2. And some of that knowledge is kind of a little bit of a prerequisite for some of the Unit 3 and 4 content. I know it's not officially a prerequisite, but we had noticed that there's a lot of content that comes up in Unit 3 particularly, where we just feel like it might be helpful to have a little introductory chapter, even just to outline, the major differences between criminal and civil law. It doesn't really get covered explicitly before just jumping into some of the detailed complex content for Unit 3. So we're going to have a little intro chapter. We also have an approaching exam style questions, little bit of an explainer at the start of our book, which really goes through the details of the Edrolo approach to preparing students for exams, which I'll be looking at in the next couple of slides. Besides that, we have a lesson for each study design dot point, although there are some exceptions where sometimes some are combined or split, and we follow the order of the study design. So it's really clear, hopefully, to students where they're up to in relation to progressing through the course. We also have a little AOS review after each AOS, and they've been designed so that they could be used as a practice SAC. So they're about the length of what you might expect a SAC to be, depending, I know everybody's a little bit different with that, but they could really be used as that practice SAC that really prepares the student to do the actual SAC for that AOS. We also have unit reviews, which are essentially set up as practice exams. So like the AOS reviews, the unit reviews or the course review that comes at the very end of Unit 3 and 4, they're basically set up like the exam with a Section A and a Section B. So the Section A replicates what VCAR usually have for their Section A of exams, and Section B replicates the VCAR exam Section B, which has 2 or 3 pieces of source material as stimulus, and then questions that relate to and need to incorporate that stimulus material into the answer. We also have lots of visuals to easily navigate between, chapters and which concepts are covered in the lesson. We have exam style questions with comprehensive answers and guidelines for approaching each question in every single lesson, so covering every single dot point. And they have a range of different command terms that are adapted from VCAR exam sort of phrasing. So we try to replicate the VCAR questions as much as we can so that students can really practice with those questions and hopefully be prepared for that external exam at the end of the year. We also have a glossary. Something new we're using this year also is we're going to be including some trigger warnings at the beginning of lessons, or perhaps beside particularly problematic or concerning content that could be potentially triggering for students in terms of something that may be traumatizing for students if they've experienced something similar to what the example might be about, or if it's something that we think students might need or might want to avoid, or might want to have support available for them for. So we'll also be including a support guide that will have things like websites and phone numbers, perhaps in relation to mental health support, or even legal information and advice if certain content might sort of trigger students to be affected by that content, because we know that there is a lot of possibility of that in the legal studies course. All right, besides that, all of our lessons in the textbook, all of the chapters will have real world examples, which are examples from the real world to provide context for the legal principles or concepts being learnt about in that particular lesson. But we also have legal cases where the focus is on the actual case itself. We also have hypothetical scenarios where we need to provide some context to help students learn, but there might not be a real world example or a legal case that is appropriate to use. All right, there's a lot of content on these next few slides. I'm not going to talk about them all in detail because we're simply running out of time. So I'm going to flick through and just let you know that these are some of the features we have in our textbook. And let you have a bit of a read through as I flick through, and know that you can come back to these slides at a later date. I will just point out the difference between our key terms or definitions and our legal vocab. One of those is designed to ensure that students have learnt the terminology that is examinable, whereas the legal vocabulary is there just to help students to use that legal terminology in their answers. So we've distinguished between the kind of must learn definitions and those that are simply helpful to improve knowledge and exam answers. Now, Clinton looks like he wants to jump in.
No, not at all. I was just going to say, because it's quite, as we said earlier, the slides will be shared with everyone. But I assume also, Kristen, if there are any questions that come up after this that you're happy for people to reach out, we're certainly available. We'll share all our contact details, etc. And I know you've also flagged some samples as well, Kristen, that we can just make sure we share with people as well. I was just going to say that because, yeah, obviously, as you said, conscious of time, want to make sure people get everything that they need. So much. It's so dense, isn't it?
There is a lot. There's a lot to unpack. I'll quickly flick through these in the next 30 seconds and we'll pass on to Adam, who's going to talk about our online platform. So quickly, we just have some features. We've got a specific way that we're dealing with the principles of justice. I'll let you look at that in your own time. We have features, we've spoken about some of these. There are some screenshots to just show you what some of those features look like. I won't read through all of those. There's a really detailed example of how we deal with our questions and answers. And if you're familiar with Edrolo, you might be familiar with our checklist style of guiding students how to answer questions. I will just make the comment, though, that we're well aware that in legal studies, the exams are not marked with a marking guide where students receive 1 mark for each component of their response. We're well aware that most legal studies exam questions are really marked holistically on the judgment of how well the student has answered the question, and that there are no solutions to legal studies exam questions in most cases. So what we do is we provide a lot of guidance for students of how they could approach the question rather than saying this is the answer. We provide scaffolding for students so that they can be supported in knowing how they can best approach an extended response question that may be a bit daunting when they first look at it. We provide them a lot of guidance on how they can use some of the help we're giving them to then formulate a long response. So you can have a look at those examples there in your own time. You can also get in touch and get access to some of our samples if you would like to, if you haven't already got those, and read through some of these. Feel free to send us through any questions after this presentation. But I better hand it over to Adam. If you want, you can quickly put in how you're feeling now. Hopefully you've changed into baby 2 if you were not already. Add that to the chat. Hopefully nobody is feeling number 8, although you might be after a lot of that detail. But I'm going to pass on to Adam. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much. That was great. And look, there are some questions rolling in. We'll definitely get to those. I just want to give you a quick 2-minute little demonstration. For those that are already using the Edrolo textbook, you're probably absolutely aware of the additional features that you get when you have that subscription. What I wanted to quickly show you today was those extras from the standard resource that become available when you're subscribed to the textbook course. So some of the main features and a change for next year will be every video lesson here down the course is one-to-one aligned with your textbook resource. So, 10A in the textbook will be 10A online, and it'll make it really easy for you. So that's a change from what the current resource is here. But some of those, textbook features that you're used to and love will stay, and that includes the ability to answer questions online. All of your textbook questions are also online when you have the textbook version of Edrolo, and you're able to jump in. Students can jump in, answer a question, type in their answer online. They submit their answer. The answers go through the teachers to see. They get a video solution that'll walk them through how to break down that question and also answer it. They'll have some possible points to include, exemplar responses, and then checklists to, essentially walk themselves through a high scoring response. Now, these are not one tick per mark, but more what it takes to holistically get a high scoring response. So once students have done that, they can then give themselves a confidence check and then head back to the questions and finish answering those. What it looks like for a teacher is once the students have answered those questions, they get to jump in and have a look at how their students have gone. So they can jump into a question set, click on view responses, get access to lots of data, and then you can drill down into that data and look further into some of those questions by checking out your student responses. So which parts of the questions were they doing well at? Which parts of the questions did they need some extra support with? And also dig into their answers here. So you can read their answers, see how they're self-assessed, and so on. So all of these features are available with the textbook version of Edrolo. And for some of you already using that, you're completely aware. For those that aren't and are keen to get a closer look at some of these features that open up with the textbook version, just let us know in the form that we'll send you after this session. And the representative that works with your school will get in touch about getting you some trial access to try out these features. But that's it from me. I will pass back to you, Kristen, to answer some of those questions.
Yeah, sure. If people are still around, I'm well aware people might need to leave. I've just been looking in the chat because I wasn't able to see that while I was presenting the slides. I've replied to a couple of questions. I'm just scrolling through. If you guys have seen any that you think I can answer now, I think we've answered most of them.
Yeah, I think it was just interesting we answered most of the questions as we went. There was quite a bit of commentary back and forth between people making comments and then kind of responding to each other's comments, which was really nice to see. And then a few comments around like getting samples and availability of textbooks and stuff like that. So just on that, I think there was one, Adam, maybe that you can answer around the timelines for availability of the book in terms of early commencement and things like that.
Yeah, for sure. The textbook will be ready for early commencement, so we'll be uploading those similar to how you've seen in other study design changes over the course of the year. So for the start of November, those are generally uploaded into teachers' accounts. In regards to students' accounts, that is a little bit later on once we have the data from schools for the commencement classes and in regards to hard copies, they are printed over the summer and delivered out to schools at the start of the school year as well. I believe I saw a question in regards to hard copies as well somewhere there.
I've just noticed a question about, is Edrolo going to have a sample practice report assessment task option? I assume, yeah, that's for like as an internal school assessed coursework piece of assessment. Now, that is something that hasn't yet been determined. We are looking into whether we're going to be providing activities and other resources for teacher use only. That is a possibility of something we could provide, but definitely we'll take that on board, that is something that people might appreciate, and it may be something that we have available. If you do have comments or questions, if you could pass that on, that would be really helpful to know that would be something useful. At this stage, we don't have them in the textbook, but there is a possibility of having some of these resources online.
There's just another question about timelines, Adam, from Mary. She just popped it on. Teachers will be looking at book lists in August. Will inspection copies of some description be available?
We'll have full sample chapters. So there'll be sample chapters to share with schools. I don't believe the full resource will be available in August for preview, but there'll be a number of sample chapters to give you a really good idea of the, I guess, the quality of the resource and how those chapters will be. I guess the rest of the book will look based on those chapters. The great thing about the Edrolo resource is it is not being constructed by individuals focusing on one area of study each in sort of time after school and building it in that sort of the old way textbooks have been written in the past. This very much is a team of writers writing the content together across the course of the rest of this year. So the consistency between, or I guess the inconsistency between chapters that you have maybe seen in past resources with other providers and those types of things, I don't think you'll find that same concern with the Edrolo resource.
I'll just add to that and say that, yeah, our authoring team, we're working really hard at the moment. We are authoring Unit 3 first because we know that a lot of the Unit 1 and 2 content aligns with that, and we want that to align very closely so that students that are learning Units 1 and 2 do progress to Unit 3 and have similar content. So we do have a bit of a method to how we're authoring the content, and we're not authoring chapter by chapter, we're authoring lesson by lesson. We're saving some of those lessons that need the recent examples, the Royal Commissions and parliamentary inquiries, things like that, till last, so that we can utilise the most recent inquiries. And we're definitely authoring that that final dot point in Unit 4 on the voice. Definitely authoring that last so we can have the most up-to-date information on that, and we'll be having that as a digital version as well so that we can update it as things happen over the course of the next however long it takes.
Great. Well, I am conscious, as we have said, of going over time already, and appreciate everyone sticking around for the extra 10 minutes or so. We might wrap it there unless there are any kind of urgent questions. But as I said, we'll be sending out an email in the next couple of days, either end of this week or early next week, with the slides from today, some more samples, as Kristen has mentioned, our contact details as well. So if you're interested in any more information, or you want to trial access to the current books, etc., through Adam, you can certainly we can certainly set that up for you. And similarly, if you've got questions for Kristen or any feedback or ideas, as we've heard today, which has been really nice to see, please pass it on. As you can see, very much in the thick of still building this out, but then also thinking of what we can add to it over the coming kind of year or so to make sure it's really useful for you. So that will be coming to your inbox along with the recording from today, a certificate of professional learning, and the slides, as we mentioned as well. So you've got all the detail to review. But yeah, again, just thank you to both Kristen and Adam for joining us today, and also to everyone. I love how vocal, it must be a very legal teacher thing, like how active everyone is. And we've had 3 or 4 of these professional learnings, and I don't think any group has been quite as vocal and kind of like engaged as this group. So I think it says a lot about the kind of people in the call. Very passionate, which is just amazing to see, and also just been really lovely to see you all kind of commenting on each other and giving suggestions around teaching the new study design. Like, it really does feel like a community.
It's really exciting, actually. It's really exciting.
Yeah.
Looking at this new content and how much it relates to the real world. Like, we are absolutely loving delving into all of this content and finding the real world examples. We're updating everything with like the most recent things, cases from the real world, examples that have happened that we think students will be engaged by. So hopefully teachers and students like our resource as well.
Right. And I'll include in that email also a really brief survey with like 2 or 3 questions, just so we can make sure that any professional learning we do in the future is meeting the needs of teachers like yourself. So on that note, thank you all for, again, giving up your Wednesday afternoon. To our presenters, everyone, stay warm, stay safe. Hopefully have a lovely evening.